My name is Nora Hale. I'm 32 years old, and on Mother's Day, every phone in my grandmother's backyard started vibrating at once. My mother had just sent a message to our family group chat. 41 relatives received the same attachment, an invoice for $286,000. The subject line said, "The price of raising a disappointment." Everyone turned toward me. They were waiting for tears, an apology, or some kind of breakdown. What they didn't know was that the woman charging me for raising me hadn't actually raised me during my first 6 years. My grandmother had. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I took out my phone and sent one thing to the group: a photograph. By the following morning, 40 relatives had cut my mother off. The only one who didn't was my grandmother. And Ruth didn't forgive her. She did something much harder. Before I tell you the rest, if this story keeps your attention, leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly want more stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Mother's Day in Mobile starts early. By 7 in the morning, the magnolias along Government Street were already blooming, and the humidity was so thick it seemed to cling to everything. I'm a baker. I own Hale's Bakehouse with 3 storefronts and a catering business that keeps me working more hours than I'd like. That wasn't the life I originally planned. I was halfway through an education degree at the University of South Alabama when Grandma Ruth had her first stroke. Someone had to care for her. My mother wasn't volunteering. She had only returned to my life when I was 6, after marrying Daniel Mercer and having my half-sister, Tessa. Even then, most of her attention went toward her new family. Tessa was 12 when Grandma had the stroke, so I left school, moved back to Mobile, and spent the next year dividing my time between Ruth's bedside and a rented commercial kitchen that cost me $525 a month. The bakery came from necessity. It wasn't some dream I had been chasing, but my family never saw it that way. To them, I was the girl who quit college. My mother, Celia Mercer, had a very specific way of introducing her daughters. At family gatherings, Tessa always came first. My youngest is 26 and getting married this fall to a wonderful attorney. Then she would look at me. And Nora, well, she makes cakes. She said makes cakes the way someone might talk about a child's craft project. I had catered receptions for more than 200 people. I employed 9 workers. The year before, my business had brought in more money than her real estate office. But in Celia's version of our family, I was still the dropout who played with icing. That afternoon, I pulled into Grandma Ruth's driveway carrying an orange pound cake I had started before dawn. I later learned that my mother had been preparing her message for 2 weeks. Ruth's house sat at the end of a gravel lane in Theodore, just south of Mobile. It was a small 1930s cottage with a screened porch around 3 sides, a ceiling fan that clicked on every 5th turn, and an old magnolia tree leaning over the front yard. It was the only place where I had ever felt completely safe. Ruth met me at the screen door. She was 82 years old, barely over 5 feet tall, and still had hands steady enough to thread a needle. She hugged me, smelling faintly of rose powder and mint tea. "Let me see what you brought me." She held the cake away from her, turned it once, and nodded. "You've outdone yourself again." Then she asked about the catering contract I had secured the month before, a corporate event for a Mobile hospitality company. She wanted to know the budget, how many people I would need, and whether I could finish everything on schedule. Ruth had worked as a bookkeeper her entire life. She respected numbers, and she was the only person in my family who treated my work like a real business. Inside, the house was already crowded. Aunt Marla was setting deviled eggs onto a tray. Uncle Frank was struggling with the grill on the back deck. Cousins, distant relatives, and older family members filled the rooms. It was the usual Mercer family gathering. Then I heard my mother in the kitchen, talking loudly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "I've been paying for Tessa's wedding myself. Nobody helps me. Nobody." I stopped. That wasn't true. Behind me, Ruth reached under the dish towel and squeezed my hand once. She knew it wasn't true either. The problem with a lie repeated for years is that eventually people stop hearing it as a lie. For weeks, Celia had been planting the same story. Nora never visits. She hasn't offered a cent toward the wedding. I gave up everything, and this is what I get? By the time we gathered at Ruth's house, most of the family had already decided what kind of person I was. I could see it in the way they looked at me, just a little too long, with smiles that never reached their eyes. My cousin Devin, who was 22, tried to make a joke. "So, Nora, when are you going to give the family a discount on all those cakes?" A few people laughed. It wasn't really a joke. Tessa touched my arm. "Don't let him bother you. He's only teasing." Tessa usually meant well. She was 26, engaged to an attorney named Colin, and had spent her entire life being the easy daughter. She stayed in school. She followed the plan. She rarely did anything that made Celia disappointed. She had never had to be the other daughter. I carried the cake to the table outside. There were pitchers of iced tea, paper plates, citronella candles, a small speaker playing gospel music, and insects buzzing through the trees. Then every phone went off at once. Mine vibrated in my pocket. So did Frank's, Marla's, and the phones of all the cousins sitting at the children's table. 41 phones, 1 notification. I pulled mine out. The group was called Mercer Family. The sender was Mom. At the top of the message was one word: invoice. Celia placed her glass on the table, smiled, and said, "Everyone, open your messages." The document looked professional. It had numbers, categories, a formal header, and formatting she must have spent hours creating. It read, "Celia Mercer, Statement of Account." Under that was my name, followed by the charges. Pregnancy and delivery, $8,500. Infant and toddler care, ages 0 through 2, $19,500. Childhood expenses, ages 3 through 6, $34,000. School years, ages 7 through 17, $82,000. The years I sacrificed for you, $68,000. College money you wasted, $35,000. Emotional labor, 32 years, $39,000. Total, $286,000. At the bottom, written in red, it said, "Pay this amount or admit to the family what you have always been. A failure I raised at a loss." I read it twice. The amounts were exaggerated and made up, but accuracy wasn't the point. Celia wasn't presenting a real bill. She was putting on a show, and she had chosen an audience. People around the table scrolled through the document. Some shook their heads. A few looked at me with pity. Others avoided looking at me at all. Celia sat across from me with her ankles crossed and her chin raised, like she had just delivered the final statement in a trial. Then I read the first childhood charges again. Infant and toddler care, ages 3 through 6. She had charged me for years she hadn't been there. She was claiming credit for diapers she never changed, bottles she never prepared, and nights she never spent awake with me. Those years belonged to Ruth. I placed my phone face down. The insects continued buzzing. The porch fan kept clicking, but the whole yard felt different. I started doing the math in my head, the same way I do when a supplier sends me the wrong order. If I said nothing, 41 people would leave believing I was ungrateful. They would think I had taken everything from my mother and returned nothing. They would believe I had thrown away a college education for no reason, even though I left school to care for Ruth when nobody else would. My standing in the family was already weak. After that, it would disappear completely. And my daughter Piper, who was 5, was asleep in her car seat in the driveway. Eli was supposed to bring her inside once she woke up. If Piper grew up hearing that her mother had been the family burden, she would believe it. But if I reacted badly, if I shouted or cried or called Celia a liar, I would become the dramatic, ungrateful daughter who couldn't handle the truth. Celia had designed it so she won either way. She chose Mother's Day because people hesitate to challenge their mother on Mother's Day. She sent the invoice to the whole family because a crowd feels like a jury. Aunt Marla leaned toward me. "Nora, do you want to say something?" I looked at her, then at Celia, then back at the invoice. The first 6 years of my life were listed as if they belonged to my mother, and somewhere on my phone was a photograph that proved they didn't. Under the table, Ruth took my hand. She didn't say anything. She only held on, firm and steady. It was the same hand that had guided me across that yard when I was little. Ruth knew what those years had looked like. She had lived them. I made my decision. I wasn't going to describe my childhood to people who had already chosen their side. I wasn't going to explain how Ruth rocked me to sleep, braided my hair for preschool, or taught me to read by using labels from the pantry because children's books cost more than she could afford. Stories give people room to question you. A photograph doesn't give them as much room. I had one picture in mind. It had been taken on that same porch on Mother's Day, 30 years earlier. I was a toddler on Ruth's hip. We were both squinting into the sun, and the magnolia behind us was much shorter. Celia wasn't in the picture. She had already been gone for years. Ruth was holding me the way a mother holds a child when there is no one else to do it. I picked up my phone. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice calm, "your invoice says you raised me from birth." Celia raised her chin. "That's what it says." "Including the first 6 years?" "Every one of them." "You're certain?" There was a brief pause. Her expression stayed the same, but her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Uncle Frank was sitting near the grill. He was 70, and he had been listening without saying much. Now he tilted his head. Celia noticed. "Frank, you remember. I was there every day." Frank rubbed his jaw. "I remember Ruth having that baby with her quite a lot." "That was temporary," Celia said. "I was working." "Where were you working?" Frank asked. The yard went quiet. Celia straightened. "I don't owe anyone an explanation." Then she turned toward the rest of the table. "I'm the one who raised both my daughters. I'm the one who went without so they could have a future." Marla lowered her plate. "Celia, she has a fair question. Where were you during those first years?" Celia's jaw tightened. "I was putting my life back together. That's what mothers do." "Who had Nora while you were doing that?" Frank asked. That was when I felt the mood begin to change. People who had been nodding along with Celia were now looking between her and Ruth. I kept my voice quiet. "You charged $19,500 for caring for me as a baby, and another $34,000 for ages 3 through 6. What address did we live at when I was 3? Celia blinked. "We moved around." "No, Mom. I lived here." "That was temporary." "For 6 years?" "I was working, Nora. I was building a career so I could provide a better life for you." Her voice rose slightly. I recognized that tone. It was the one she used when a real estate deal started falling apart and she needed people to stop asking questions. Around the table, people looked at the invoice again, but now they were reading it differently. Devin lowered his phone and whispered something to Marla. She nodded. Then she faced Celia. "Nora has a point." Celia's nostrils flared. "So everyone is taking her side now?" "After everything I've done?" No one answered. I still hadn't shown the photograph. I wanted to see how far she would continue. Celia stood up, pushed her chair back, and placed both hands on the table. She spoke to the family like a preacher addressing a congregation. "Let me make this simple. I carried that girl, gave birth to her, came back for her, enrolled her in school, drove her to activities, and took her to every doctor's appointment." "You enrolled me in 2nd grade," I said. "I was 7. The silence that followed was different. Everyone there knew what that meant. Someone else had handled kindergarten and first grade. Tessa looked at her mother. "Mom, you've always said you raised Nora from the beginning." "I did." "Then who handled kindergarten?" Celia turned toward her. "Tessa, this isn't your concern. It's one question." The backyard suddenly felt much smaller. The table, covered with food and the cake I had spent the morning making, sat between us. Ruth stood. She moved slowly because her knees were no longer strong. But when Ruth Mercer got to her feet, everyone paid attention. She walked through the screen door and disappeared inside. We heard the spring snap shut. About 20 seconds later, she returned carrying a battered shoebox held together with a rubber band. She placed it on the table between the iced tea and the deviled eggs. No one touched it. Ruth rested one hand on the back of her chair. "This box has been in my closet for more than 3 decades, she said. "It contains photographs, letters, and receipts from the day Nora was born until the day Celia came back for her." Celia's face lost its color. "Mom, don't." "Enough." Ruth didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I kept these records because I was a bookkeeper. I keep records." Then she looked at me. "Nora, do you want me to open it?" I shook my head. "Not yet, Grandma. Let me handle this first." She nodded and sat down, but the box stayed in the middle of the table. Celia kept staring at it. She knew what was inside. Records don't care about anyone's version of events. They don't exaggerate. They don't add emotional labor or round up expenses. They simply wait until someone needs them. Tessa leaned toward her mother and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but for the first time, it sounded like she was questioning Celia instead of agreeing with her. The box had not even been opened, and it was already changing the room. Meanwhile, messages were appearing in the family chat. Relatives who weren't at the cookout were asking what was happening, cousins in Birmingham, an aunt in Pensacola, and Ruth's brother's children in Montgomery. Most of the messages were question marks. One said, "Celia, what is this?" Another read, "This seems extreme." Celia had sent the invoice to the entire family because she wanted the group's pressure to force me into apologizing. But a group chat doesn't only move in one direction. Once everyone is invited into the conversation, they can ask questions too. Of the 41 relatives, at least 10 were old enough to remember the years Ruth had cared for me. Frank remembered. Marla remembered parts of it. Ruth's brother Arthur, who was 76 and lived in Montgomery, remembered. These people had come to this house years ago and seen me on Ruth's lap while Celia was nowhere around. They simply hadn't talked about it. Families often discuss recipes and travel plans more easily than the things that actually matter. Celia had mistaken silence for agreement. She was wrong. Silence only meant no one had been pushed far enough to speak. Tessa checked her phone. "Mom, people are asking questions." "Let them ask." But there was less confidence in her voice now, and Ruth noticed it. I still wasn't ready to send the photograph. I wanted Celia to keep talking. Every new claim gave her one more statement she couldn't take back. The afternoon heat pressed through the porch screens. The wax in the citronella candles had begun to soften, and the grill popped behind us where Frank had left the lid open. Then Celia stood again. She tapped her spoon against her glass, the same gesture she used at church luncheons whenever she wanted everyone's attention. "I have something to say to everyone here, and everyone reading the chat." The conversation stopped. "My daughter Nora has had every opportunity I could give her. I paid for her birth. I paid for her childhood. I even helped with college before she quit. And what have I received in return?" She looked directly at me. "Not money, not gratitude. She can barely visit during the holidays." She paused. "So today, in front of all of you, I'm asking her to make things right, or admit what she is." Devin was holding up his phone to record. 2 other cousins had started doing the same. Celia pointed at me. "Stand up, Nora." I stayed seated. "Say it," she ordered. "Tell me you're grateful for everything I sacrificed." I looked at her. "No." The word landed heavily. "No," I repeated, "because the invoice is false and you know it." Celia turned to the family. 32 years and she still can't say thank you. This is what I've dealt with. She leaves school, opens a small bakery, and acts like everyone else owes her something. Some relatives shifted in their chairs. Others nodded, especially the people who had heard Celia's version for weeks. Her younger cousin Renee spoke from the far end of the table. "Nora, it's Mother's Day. Just tell her you appreciate her." "I appreciate the person who raised me," I said. Celia's smile faltered. "I raised you." "You sent a $286,000 bill to 41 relatives and called me a failure. You did it on Mother's Day, in front of Ruth, the woman who actually—" "Don't you dare!" It was the first time her voice cracked, not from sadness, from losing control. "Don't sit there and act as if I wasn't your mother." "I'm not denying that. I'm asking you to tell the truth about the timeline." "I was there." She shouted it so loudly that a child at the far end of the yard began to cry. Tessa reached for her arm. "Mom, please sit down." Celia pulled away. Her eyes were wet, and for a moment I saw something beneath the performance. She needed her story to be true. She had repeated it for so long that she had built her entire identity around it. I could have listed every address and every year. I could have explained how Ruth stayed awake with me while Celia built another life somewhere else. I could have told everyone about the money I had been sending Ruth for the past 5 years, to repair the roof, pay for rehabilitation after another stroke, and replace the water heater. But arguing louder wouldn't make the truth stronger. The only way to end a story someone had rehearsed for decades was to show proof they couldn't talk around. "Mom," I said, "you charged me for the first 6 years of my life. I raised you. Then you'll recognize what I'm about to send." I picked up my phone and opened the photo folder. The picture was an old instant photograph that I had scanned years earlier. The colors had faded, and the image had a yellow cast. Ruth stood on that same porch with the same screens and the same uneven floorboards. She was holding a baby in a yellow romper. Flour covered the front of her apron. The date written on the white strip at the bottom was in Ruth's careful handwriting, May 11th, 1997, Mother's Day. The baby was me. Celia was not in the photograph. She wasn't in the house either. She had been gone from my life for years. I looked at my mother, then at the family chat. Under the photograph I typed, "Happy Mother's Day to the woman who truly raised me." My thumb hovered over the screen. I hadn't planned any of this. I had come with a cake because Ruth wanted me there. Even after everything, I still showed up when family called. But Celia had sent me a bill and called me a failure in front of 41 people. She had charged me $53,500 for 6 years she hadn't lived through. All I had was one photograph of the woman who had actually held me. I pressed send. The picture appeared in the chat at 5:18 p.m. Every phone on the porch buzzed. Then the phones of the relatives in Birmingham, Pensacola, Montgomery, Gulfport, and the other places where our family lived started buzzing too. 41 phones, one photograph, one sentence. People looked at their screens, then at me, then at Celia, and finally at Ruth. Ruth sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing. Devin lowered his camera. Marla covered her mouth. Frank closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. Tessa zoomed in on the photograph. She studied the date, then looked at Ruth, then at her mother. For the first time I could remember, Tessa didn't defend Celia. She simply placed her phone face down. That was when everything began to turn. If you were in my position, would you have sent the photograph or stayed quiet? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to know what happened the next morning, when 40 relatives did one thing and Ruth did something completely different, subscribe, because I never expected what came next. The first person to speak was Uncle Frank. He didn't address Celia. He spoke to the table. "I remember that porch," he said, holding up his phone. "I remember Ruth standing there with that baby. Spring of '97. Celia's voice came out sharp. "Frank, you'd been gone since the fall of '94, hadn't you?" "I was working in Pensacola." "You were there for almost 3 years, Celia." Marla looked up from her phone. "You charged Nora for the years Mom raised her?" "That photograph proves nothing," Celia snapped. "It proves someone is holding your child," Frank said, "and it isn't you." A cousin named Linda, who was 58, turned toward Ruth. "Is it true? Did you have Nora all those years?" Ruth folded her napkin carefully. 6 years, she said. "From the day Celia left that baby on my porch until the day she came back for her." Nora was 6 by then. She had already lost her first tooth in my kitchen. That detail affected everyone. The argument was no longer about numbers on a page. It was about a grandmother putting a lost tooth beneath a pillow, brushing a child's hair, making breakfast, and taking her to school while the child's own mother lived somewhere else. Celia gripped the edge of the table. "I came back. I raised her after that. That has to count for something." "No one is saying it doesn't," I told her, "but you cannot charge me for the years you missed." Ruth held out her hand. I gave her my phone. She lifted the photograph so the people around the table could see it. "I took this picture," she said. "Mother's Day, 1997. Nora was still little. I had been caring for her since she was only a few months old." She set the phone down. "I didn't raise her for money. I raised her because she was mine to raise. Her mother left, and somebody had to stay." I watched Celia gripping her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. "Grandma, you don't have to do this," I said. "Yes, I do." Ruth's voice was calm and level. "For more than 30 years, I kept quiet because Celia is my daughter. I hoped she would eventually admit the truth, even if she never admitted it to anyone else." She looked at Celia. "But today, you sent Nora a bill. You charged her for the years I spent rocking her to sleep, teaching her letters from pantry labels, and walking her to the bus in the rain." Then Ruth looked at me. "I taught her to read. I taught her how to measure flour. I taught her to say please and thank you. When she opened that bakery, I thought, that is what she learned in my kitchen." My throat tightened. I didn't cry, not in front of everyone, and not while Celia was falling apart across from me. But Ruth had shown me those things in 1,000 ways. She had never said them out loud before. Now the whole family had heard them. Devin was the one who asked the next question. He had been reading the messages from relatives who weren't at the house. "Aunt Celia, why send this now? Why today, right before Tessa's wedding?" The question stayed in the air. Celia didn't answer. Tessa turned toward her. "Mom?" "Nothing." "Mom, are we having money problems?" Celia pressed her lips together and stared at the magnolia tree. "I saw the catering estimate," Tessa continued, "and the venue deposit. The florist, too. Where is that money supposed to come from?" Marla set down her plate. "You told me the wedding was already covered." "It is," Celia said. "With what?" Frank asked. "Your commissions have been falling since the market slowed," he continued. "I know because someone on my street listed with you and withdrew the property." The tension in the yard shifted into understanding. Everyone was doing the same math I had done months earlier. Celia hadn't sent me that invoice because she truly believed I owed her $286,000. She sent it because she needed money. The so-called failure she had raised at a loss was supposed to write a check large enough to fund Tessa's wedding. Tessa looked at her mother as if she had just realized she had been following the wrong map. "You told me Nora was selfish," she said quietly. "You said she never gave anything back." "She hasn't," Celia replied. "She paid for Grandma's roof," Tessa said, "and her rehabilitation. Grandma told me last Christmas." I stood. "I didn't send that photograph to embarrass you, Mom." Celia wouldn't look at me. "I sent it because I'm done being called something I'm not. I'm not your failure, and I'm not your debtor." I took a breath. I left college because Grandma needed help, and nobody else stepped forward. Through the screen door, I could see Piper now lying on a blanket in the living room. Eli had brought her inside, and she was asleep with her thumb in her mouth. She had no idea that her family was breaking apart just a few feet away. "Don't ever call me a failure in front of my daughter," I said. I said it once, calmly, and I meant it permanently. Then I sat down and placed my hand on Ruth's arm. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything you did and everything you're still doing." Ruth covered my hand with hers. Her eyes were wet, but she only nodded. Celia was staring at the shoebox. She knew it contained more than the photograph. "This is over," she said as she stood. "I'm leaving. That's your choice." She picked up her purse. "Tessa, come on." Tessa didn't move. "I'm staying," she said. Celia stared at her. "What did you say?" "I'm staying. I want to talk to Grandma." My mother walked away from the porch alone. Her shoes struck the gravel. A moment later, her car started, and then she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Eli put Piper to bed and sat beside me on the couch without trying to fill the silence. That was one of the things he did best. He knew when simply being there was enough. I opened the family chat. The photograph remained at the top like evidence in a trial. Beneath it were message after message from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Arthur, Ruth's brother in Montgomery, typed in all capital letters, "I remember Ruth having that baby. Celia was not there. This is the truth." Marla sent a voice message. I played it quietly. "Celia, I love you, but what you did was wrong. You know it was wrong." Linda posted a photograph from a Mercer family reunion in 1998. Ruth was holding me on her lap. I was about 4 years old. Celia was nowhere in the picture. By 9:30, people began leaving the group chat. Some blocked Celia. Others left the conversation entirely. I hadn't asked anyone to do it. One by one, 40 relatives removed themselves from my mother's life. Eli watched the number with me. 37, he said. A little later, it became 39. Just before midnight, it reached 40. Only one person remained who hadn't blocked Celia, Ruth. I texted her, "Grandma, are you okay?" She answered a few minutes later, "I'm all right, sweetheart. I'm not blocking her." "You don't have to." "I know, but I'm not finished." I stared at those words for a long time. I didn't yet understand what she meant. By morning, I would. 40 relatives had cut my mother off. The 41st, Ruth, had refused to. What do you think she did instead? Did she forgive Celia, or did she do something more serious? Tell me what you think before I continue. And if you're still listening, subscribe, because what Ruth did the next morning is the part of this story I will never forget. The next afternoon, Ruth called everyone individually. She didn't use the group chat. She called one person at a time, the same way she had organized family gatherings for decades. "Come to the house at 2:30, she told them. "There's something I need to show you." I drove over with Piper in the back seat and a knot in my stomach. Eli stayed home. He said this was a Mercer family matter, and he was right. When I arrived, the porch was full again. Marla was there, along with Frank, Devin, Linda, Arthur, and several other relatives. Arthur had driven nearly 4 hours from Montgomery. Tessa was sitting on the porch swing with her arms folded. She looked as though she hadn't slept. Celia was absent. Ruth sat at the head of the table. All the dishes had been cleared away except the shoebox. She looked smaller than she had the day before, and for a moment I wondered whether the confrontation was too much for her. Then she looked at me. I saw the same determination she used to show when I was a child and came home crying from school. The look said, "We deal with this." "I kept this box for more than 30 years, Ruth began. "I kept it because I hoped I would never need it. I kept it to protect my daughter." She pulled off the rubber band. "But yesterday, Celia stood in my yard on Mother's Day and called my granddaughter a failure. She charged Nora for love that I gave freely." Ruth lifted the lid. "So I'm finished protecting her." Inside were photographs, a small leather ledger, and a folded letter with yellowed edges. Ruth opened the letter carefully. It was written in blue ink on lined notebook paper. Celia's handwriting. "This is the note my daughter left on my kitchen table the night she brought Nora to me," Ruth said. "October 18th, 1994. She didn't read the entire letter. She only read 3 lines. "Mom, I can't do this." Then, "She's more than I can handle. I'm not made for this." And finally, "Please keep her until I'm ready to come back." Ruth's voice caught slightly before she continued. In the margins, Celia had written the word failure twice. The porch went completely still. Everyone understood at the same time that the family story had been backwards. Celia hadn't sacrificed everything for me. She had left. She had written that her own baby was too much for her, handed me to Ruth, and walked away. Years later, she returned and turned herself into the hero. She made me the ungrateful disappointment instead. Tessa was shaking. "She told me she was always there," she whispered. Arthur removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Ruth, we should have spoken up sooner." "Yes," Ruth said. "All of us should have." She placed the letter face up on the table and set the lid beside it. Then she reached into the box again and pulled out the leather ledger. "For the past 8 years, I've also been lending Celia money," she said. "She asked me not to tell anyone." She opened to a marked page. There were entries for $1,500 when Celia fell behind on her car payment, $4,500 after a real estate closing collapsed, and $10,000 toward Tessa's wedding venue. There were dozens of smaller amounts too, $700, $1,200, and other payments made whenever Celia asked. Ruth closed the book. "The total is $34,700. Marla covered her mouth. Frank let out a long breath. "So when she says nobody helps her," Marla asked. "She was being helped by me," Ruth answered. "Every time. She never told anyone." I had known Ruth helped Celia sometimes. She had mentioned it once, casually, as though it were a minor note in a bookkeeping report. I hadn't known the total. $34,700 from an 82-year-old woman living on a fixed pension. Ruth stood. It took her a moment, and Devin started to move toward her, but she waved him away. "Celia, if you hear about this, and I know you will, listen carefully." She addressed the porch in the same direct way she had spoken to the family the day before. "I'm done. No more loans. No more covering for you." She placed both hands on the table. "Until you tell the truth to your daughters, to this family, and to yourself, you are not welcome in this house." That was all. There was no shouting, no insults, no dramatic speech. Just a boundary drawn by an 82-year-old bookkeeper. After Ruth finished, Tessa came over to me. Mascara had run beneath her eyes, and her engagement ring caught the afternoon light. "Nora," she said. I waited. I believed her. My entire life, I believed everything she told me. She said you were selfish. She said you walked away. She said you didn't care. She wiped her cheek. "I'm sorry." I hugged her before I could think about it. She held on longer than I expected. "I didn't know about the letter," she said against my shoulder. "I didn't know she left you." "I know. And the money you've been sending Grandma, the roof, the rehabilitation, all of it. Mom told me you never contributed anything. Mom told you many things. Tessa pulled back. What am I supposed to do now? Find out what's true, I said. Then go from there. I didn't list every cruel thing Celia had done. I didn't ask Tessa to choose sides. I didn't post anything online or call relatives to make sure they had heard the story correctly. I had said what needed to be said. The photograph had done the rest, and Celia's own letter had settled everything else. On the drive home, Eli asked if I was okay. The trees blurred past the windows. Piper was singing softly in the back seat, one of the old lullabies Ruth had sung to me when I was her age. Yeah, I said. I think I am. 2 weeks later, the consequences had become clear. Celia lost her position on the church hospitality committee. They asked her to step aside, which everyone understood meant she was no longer welcome there. 3 real estate clients withdrew their listings. In Mobile, news travels slowly but thoroughly. Tessa's large wedding was canceled, not the marriage, only the production surrounding it. She and Colin went to the courthouse instead. She wore a white sundress. Later, she told me, I didn't need 150 people watching me say I do. I only needed to mean it. Ruth kept her word. She didn't call Celia, text her, or send her any more money. Celia started counseling. Tessa told me she cried for about half an hour during her second session. I didn't feel pleased about that. Mostly, I felt tired. My own life didn't change in some dramatic way. I went back to the bakery the next Tuesday and made 480 biscuits for a corporate breakfast. That's what a business is. It isn't a story. It's a schedule. But relatives I hadn't heard from in years started calling. Devin, who had joked about free cakes, came by and asked if I was hiring. I was. Later that summer, the Mobile Riverfront Association offered me the catering contract for its fall festival. It was a 3-day event expected to draw about 3,500 people. It had nothing to do with the family drama. They had been watching my work for a year. A few weeks later, I posted one photograph. Ruth was sitting at the counter in my shop, eating orange pound cake with flour in her hair. The caption said, "The woman who raised me." Celia clicked the heart beneath it. She didn't comment. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't enough, but it was the first honest thing she had done in more than 30 years. In early fall, Ruth invited me over for supper. She made pot roast, used the good dishes, and poured iced tea from scratch. I didn't open that box to punish your mother, she said. She set down her spoon. I opened it because she stood in my yard and called the result of my work a failure. Ruth looked at me. I chose to raise you when I was 49, and my pension barely covered one person. I would make the same choice again every day. But I will not sit in my own house while someone charges you for the love I gave you. You didn't destroy Celia, she continued. She did that herself. You only stopped carrying her lie. We ate with the screen door open and the porch fan clicking every 5th turn. Thanksgiving was held at Ruth's house again. There were 12 people at the table this time. Fewer than usual, but everyone there had chosen to come. Through the kitchen window, I saw Celia's car. She stayed behind the wheel for almost a minute before getting out. Then she walked inside and asked Ruth if she could help. Ruth handed her a small knife. Carrots. When Celia saw me, she said, "Nora, I'm glad you came." I said I would. She glanced toward me. "Your shop, the festival contract, that's really something." "Thank you, Mom." There was no hug and no tearful reunion. She was in therapy. She was trying. After dinner, I sat on the porch with Piper and opened the photograph on my phone. "See that woman?" I asked. "That's your great-grandmother, Ruth. And that baby is Mama." "She's holding you," Piper said. "Yeah, sweetheart. She held me for a very long time." My mother sent me a bill to prove I was a failure. I answered with one photograph, and the truth raised me all over again. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself in your own family, tell me about it in the comments.